Shalom Aleichem. My name is Avi Hoffman, and I am the founder and CEO of the Yiddishkeit Initiative, and on behalf of our festival sponsor, the Betsy Hotel South Beach, I welcome you to the inaugural international virtual Why I Love Yiddish Fest 2020. Now, you may ask, what is the Yiddishkeit Initiative, and why have a Why I Love Yiddish Fest in 2020? So the answer is the Yiddishkeit Initiative is a non-profit organization that I founded with my mother, Columbia University professor Miriam Hoffman, and we are dedicated to preserving, presenting, and promoting the best in Jewish culture and Yiddish language. And why a Why I Love Yiddish Fest is because we are proud of our culture. We are proud of our heritage. We are proud of our language. And apparently 85% of the Jewish people don't consider themselves affiliated with any Jewish organization, but they do consider themselves cultural Jews. So for those who are affiliated, for those who are not affiliated, for those who are Jewish and for those who aren't Jewish, we should celebrate this incredible 5,000-year-old culture. The Yiddish language is over 1,000 years old. It's deep, it's beautiful, it's rich, and it should be celebrated. So sit back and enjoy our next program, and thank you for your support. I'm Avi Hoffman, co-founder with my mother, Professor Miriam Hoffman, of the Yiddishkeit Initiative. We welcome you to our inaugural week-long international virtual Why I Love Yiddish Fest, celebrating and promoting Jewish history, life, and culture, and their positive and far-reaching impact on the world. 75 years ago, had there been a different outcome to the most horrific war the world has ever known, I wouldn't be here today, as my father was a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Thankfully, it ended with the official surrender of Japan to the U.S. on September 2nd, 1945. Now we are able to celebrate our culture with concerts, play readings, film screenings, and lectures from all over the world. We seek to reinforce the often cited quote that sacrifice without remembrance is meaningless. Throughout this week, Our Liberation Commemoration programs will acknowledge the significance of that occasion, along with another important historic milestone, the end of the war in Europe on May 8, 1945, VE Day. This opening ceremony was created by a member of our board of directors who has worked tirelessly for the past 6 months to bring it to fruition. I am proud to present Joan Lyman to share the inspiration for its genesis.
Good afternoon. My name is Joan Lyman, and I'm a member of the board of directors of Yiddishkeit Initiative. I'm also the creator and producer of today's Liberation Commemoration ceremony, designed to pay tribute to World War II veterans and Holocaust survivors in the year marking the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. I got the idea last June when I took a Jewish heritage cruise down the Rhine River, visiting cities along the way that formed the cradle of Ashkenazic Jewry beginning in the Middle Ages. The onboard guide was the nationally known faculty member of the university in Boca Raton, Dr. Robert Watson. Prior to joining our cruise, Robert had been the guest lecturer on a cruise to France, the focus of which was a visit to Normandy, for ceremonies marking the 75th anniversary of D-Day. One night, over cocktails in the lounge, Robert shared how moving the experience had been. That conversation lit a spark in me to produce a similar event in the United States to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe and the liberation of the last of the concentration camps. The ceremony was originally scheduled to occur this past April, but the arrival of a war on U.S. shores, the battle against COVID-19, forced us to postpone. It was rescheduled for the first week of September so that we could include activities in commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the end of the war in the Pacific, VJ Day, September 2nd, 1945, as well as honor the South Florida first responders and healthcare professionals who continue to risk their lives on a daily basis in the fight against coronavirus. Thank you for joining us today.
Proclamation. The Miami-Dade County Office of the Mayor and Board of County Commissioners. Whereas, Miami-Dade County is committed to honoring those organizations in our midst who elevate and enhance our overall quality of life. And, whereas, the Yiddishkeit Initiative, a nonprofit organization, is marking the 75th anniversary of VE Day, as well as the liberation of the last concentration camps in the spring of 1945. And, whereas, South Florida is home to one of the largest groups of Holocaust survivors in the United States and is also home to a high percentage of World War veterans. And, whereas, this important event will take place at the Betsy Hotel in Miami Beach and will allow persons to hear first-hand testimonials from Holocaust survivors. And, whereas, it is fitting and proper that official acknowledgement be given to all those affiliated with the Yiddishkeit Initiative as they commemorate the 75th anniversary of VE Day. Now, therefore, be it resolved that I, Carlos A. Gimenez, Mayor of Miami-Dade County, Chairwoman Audrey M. Edmondson, and the members of the Board of County Commissioners, on behalf of Miami-Dade County and this community, do hereby proclaim Monday, September 7th, 2020, as Liberation Commemoration Day. In observance thereof, I call upon the good people of Miami-Dade County to join me in paying deepest respect to all the Holocaust survivors and World War veterans in our midst. Dear Mr. Hoffman, thank you for reaching out regarding the Yiddishkeit Initiative's upcoming virtual International Arts Festival. It sounds like you have an exciting event planned. It was a pleasure meeting you and your daughter Liana during the 2016 Arts for Life Scholarship Luncheon and Awards Ceremony. As you may know, Arts for Life was started by my wife Columba in 1999 to recognize the creativity and artistic talents of high school students throughout Florida. Annually, Arts for Life awards $1,000 scholarships to 25 Florida high school seniors who demonstrate academic and artistic excellence in the visual arts, music, dance, drama, or creative writing. In the program's 2 decades, more than $600,000 in scholarships have been awarded to over 525 talented students in recognition of their achievements in the arts. Past winners have gone on to attend some of the most prestigious visual and performing arts schools in the country, like Juilliard and Carnegie Mellon. Previous winners can also be found acting on Broadway in New York City, performing in symphonies and orchestras across the globe, dancing alongside the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater, or working as a storyboard artist at Nickelodeon Animation. Each year, Columba and I are in awe of the extraordinary talent of the students that are awarded an Arts for Life scholarship and excited to see where their talents take them. Their dedication to their craft and their education is an inspiration to us all. Thank you for your continued support of the arts and arts education. This year, especially, we have seen how the arts can bring people from all across the world together and provide comfort and joy during times of uncertainty. I am certain your upcoming virtual International Arts Festival will do that and more. Sincerely, Jeb Bush, Chairman, Foundation for Excellence in Education.
Hi, it's Ted Deutch. Thanks for letting me join this Yiddishkeit Initiative program. This year we commemorate 75 years since the end of World War II and the liberation of the Nazi camps in Europe. And I was privileged to travel with Speaker Pelosi to Europe to mark 75 years since the liberation of Auschwitz and also 75 years since the Battle of the Bulge. And this battle was pivotal. It was monumental, as I'm sure all of you know. The Americans and our allies knew that the German offensive had to be stopped. And over the course of more than a month, the Allies triumphed, and it was a turning point in the war. But it wasn't without a major loss. Almost 90,000 Americans lost their lives holding the line and fighting to save the world from the Nazis. My father was one of those young men who fought in that battle and survived. He earned a Purple Heart for his bravery, and it left battle scars that he carried with him for the rest of his life. I was always so proud of my dad. I grew up hearing stories of veterans of foreign wars who risked everything in defense of our country, and I knew that he was one of those heroes. It took chutzpah, but committing yourself to putting your life on the line for our nation just might be the highest form of patriotism. And through today, I've maintained my deepest gratitude for our veterans and those who have served. But patriotism can take different forms. Look no further than the current public health crisis and those on the front lines, particularly in our state where the virus continues to spread rapidly. Over 600,000 people affected and more than 10,000 having lost their lives. And it's the doctors and nurses and first responders who are playing such a crucial role in healing people and stopping the spread and in saving lives. We owe them our deepest appreciation for putting their health on the line. And for all they do to keep us safe, we've got to do more to help them. That's why Congress should offer these frontline heroes hazard pay and other benefits. And state and local governments need to do more to support them as well. But there's something that each of us can do to help them right now in their fight. And that's doing our part to stop the spread of the virus so that fewer people need to go to hospitals. It means staying home if you can. And when you're out, avoiding large crowds. And by all means, always wear a mask. Even 75 years later, we're forever indebted to the greatest generation for how they saved our country. And this new class of heroes, the frontline healthcare heroes, they'll be remembered for what they did at this moment to protect our country. And I hope that we'll be remembered for what we did to help protect them as well. Thanks so much for this important initiative, and thanks for letting me join with you today.
Thank you for this opportunity to join you at the virtual opening day ceremony of the virtual Yiddishkeit Initiative Love Jewish Fest. I'm honored to be able to participate in this commemoration. Our shared Jewish values, such as Tikkun Olam, compelled me into a life of public service, eventually becoming the first Jewish congresswoman from Florida. I approach my public service through a distinctly Jewish lens. That responsibility includes ensuring we come together to honor our past and look to the future, L'Dor V'Dor. The Liberation Commemoration is an opportunity to honor the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II and the liberation of the concentration camps. We remember our brave men and women, our greatest generation who fought across the world and here at home for freedom and democracy, justice and peace, and the rights of all those who could not defend themselves. We remember the 6 million Jews and millions of other innocent people who perished at the hands of the Nazis. We mourn those who lost their lives during one of history's darkest moments, and recommit ourselves to upholding the principle of never again. The anniversary also serves as a reminder that in the face of cruelty and suffering, we must always be the liberators and not the bystanders. We must courageously ask questions instead of thoughtlessly taking orders. We must defend those who are defenseless instead of feebly accepting the status quo. Today we are in the midst of a new kind of war, fighting against an invisible enemy. The future veterans of this war are not soldiers, at least not in the traditional sense. They are doctors, nurses, physician assistants, and paramedics. These heroes carry the enormous responsibility of keeping us healthy and caring for us when we're sick. We honor the resiliency of healthcare professionals, emergency responders, and all those whose work requires them to rush to the front lines of our battle against COVID-19. During this pandemic, they have continued to do their life-saving jobs with love and care, courage and conviction, in the face of great risk to themselves and their families. When the rest of us sought shelter from this virus, they rushed in, showing us what Tikkun Olam and Gemilut Hasadim really looks like. COVID-19 is rampaging through our communities and hospitals are overcrowded with patients. We must ensure that our healthcare heroes are equipped and supported in this fight. They need personal protective equipment, PPE, and hazard pay. Despite shortages, healthcare workers have carried on. The compassion and ingenuity of those on the front line of this invisible war never ceases to amaze me. I met nurses who went as far as to construct homemade masks and gowns when supplies ran low. And I have heard countless stories of nurses standing by the side of patients when hospitals couldn't let their families visit. As a breast cancer survivor, I know how meaningful their comforting touch and reassuring words can be. The Yiddishkeit initiative Love Jewish Fest reminds us all of the resiliency of humankind. Just as we survived the atrocities in our past, we will survive this invisible war too. Today, we reaffirm our commitment to eliminating insidious killers of all kinds, especially this pandemic that has already claimed too many lives. We will get through this together, but we cannot do it without our healthcare heroes. I'm proud to honor them with you today.
Hello everyone, thank you Yiddishkeit Initiative for allowing me the opportunity to speak for such an amazing virtual celebration. Mazel Tov on commemorating the 75th anniversary milestone of the liberation of the Jewish people and the end of World War II. This occasion certainly deserves a proper in-person commemoration, but today we get to reach so many people that otherwise wouldn't be able to watch. Having my entire mishpochen running around my house, I will try not to turn mishuganan on all of us. That being said, Miami is honored to take part in this ceremony and continue to pursue a safe, inclusive, and respectful society for all of our residents.
War in the Pacific Theater came to an end with the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and victory was declared over Japan. It may seem incongruous to hear the words war and theater uttered in the same sentence, since one conjures up atrocity and sacrifice, and the other, pleasure and entertainment. But the association between theatrical and military worlds dates back to the gladiators of ancient Rome, trained combatants who would engage in fighting to the death in public arenas like the Colosseum as a form of entertainment. It entered military parlance thanks to the term Kriegstheater, war theater, that appeared in an early 19th century book entitled On War by the Prussian general Karl von Clausewitz. In modern times, it has come to be defined as the area of air, land, and water that is or may become directly involved in the conduct of war. Action took place in 2 theaters during World War II: Europe, including the Mediterranean and North Africa, and the Pacific. Since today's ceremony commemorating the war's end is the opening act for a week-long performing arts event, it seemed only fitting to program it as a work of theater. Here, then, is a short 3-act play that recounts the roles played by several heroic individuals, both soldiers and civilians, in the 2 theaters of World War II. The first scene is about my grandfather, United States Coast Guard Captain Ellis Samuel Gordon, as told by 2 of his children, my father and my aunt.
I have the pleasure of being virtually here with the family of Ellis Samuel Gordon, who was a top-ranking career officer in the U.S. Coast Guard. In my opinion, an unsung hero despite never having set foot on a battlefield or on a ship.
My name is Howard Gordon, and my dad was Ellis Gordon, who served for over 30 years as an active duty officer in the United States Coast Guard.
I'm Roberta Gordon. I am the youngest of Ellis and Annette Gordon's 3 children. I will be talking more about Dad shortly.
I'm a film, television voiceover, and stage actress, and I had the great honor of narrating some of my grandfather's letters.
Roberta, start at the beginning, a little bit about him, and take us through his college years.
Born August 12, 1909, in Baltimore, Maryland, into an Orthodox Jewish household. His sister Dina was 9 years older. He survived the Spanish flu epidemic, graduated from what we would now call a high school, Baltimore Polytechnic, and went on to Johns Hopkins University and received his degree in civil engineering.
Tell us, how did he meet your mom?
A cousin of Ellis's, a female cousin, challenged him to go on a blind date with a nursing student from Richmond, and they were married on Christmas Day in 1932.
Did he join? How did that come about?
The lighthouse service that he was in was merged with the Coast Guard, and that's why he continued as a Coast Guard officer because of that merger.
Now bring us up to Ellis's wartime service.
It was a top secret thing that there was even such a thing as long-range aids to navigation, LORAN. The top secret operation that at the time Lieutenant Commander Gordon was involved with was he was the senior officer in Alaska, 1942 to 1945, to locate and construct and oversee the operation of a half a dozen LORAN stations in the Aleutian Islands, from which we could send out beacons, and our bombers taking off from aircraft carriers could know where they were and find their way to bomb the Japanese mainland.
Your father may never have set foot on an aircraft carrier or on a battleship without his overseeing the construction of the LORAN towers from his post in Alaska. These things may not have ever successfully been carried out. Tell us about the audio books. Perhaps you can help us experience what Ellis experienced by reading one of them.
Yes, I have one here. Here we go.
Great.
The letters were heavily censored for security, obviously. Thursday night, November 4th, 1943. Meals cost me 70 cents per day. Good prices. Steaks, roast beef, chicken, salads, a variety of fresh vegetables, fruits, and etc. No worry about rationing. Laundry is taken care of here, $3 per month. We're short of officers. I'm trying to hold down my own job and that of district supervisor as well. All my love to Mom, Pop, and all of you, Ellis. A little snapshot from his world.
Tell us a little bit about your service. What did you do there?
I'm a retired lieutenant commander in the Coast Guard Reserve. Went to officer candidate school, stationed at Elizabeth City, North Carolina, which is an aircraft repair and supply base not far from Kitty Hawk, where the Wright brothers learned how to fly.
Roberta.
When Dad got out of the war, they went back to the mid-Atlantic states. They then moved to South Florida from 1947 to 1954.
He was the district engineer, and the district ran from Key West up to Charleston. And his job was to inspect the various Coast Guard installations in the district. He would get on a Coast Guard cutter, and the boat would go out to a lighthouse, and he would get off the ship and go up to the lighthouse and inspect the lighthouse and inspect the light. And as a little kid in the middle school, sometimes he would take me with him, and we climbed up the narrow stairs to the very top of the light and looked at the Fresnel lens and so on.
When did he actually retire from the Coast Guard?
In November of 1960.
What did he do in civilian life?
When he went for his discharge physical, there was a problem, and he was put into HEW, Health Education and Welfare Facility, hospital in Baltimore for that entire summer of 1960. After he recovered, he did land a job with the American Wood Preservers Institute.
In terms of his discharge and having a medical problem, do you think that that was related in any way to possible radiation or effects of having served in Alaska during those time frames?
There have been a number of people who were involved in Loran at the time he was involved with Loran in Alaska, who have since developed symptoms of being involved with excess radiation. But the answer is we don't know for sure, but it seems like there's a good chance that since he ultimately developed cancer, it might have been related to his Loran work in Alaska during the war.
Americans need to know the sacrifices that people have given in terms of their lives and their health. In this case, very possibly his own life may have been affected by that.
Presently, which means last week, I've been in touch with an admiral in the Coast Guard at headquarters trying to get information released from the Freedom of Information Act. Almost all the people who are involved are no longer with us anymore, to find out what further information may be available.
Good luck with those efforts. And Roberta?
What a great and talented human being he was, how fair and kind he was, how much all of us loved critters, loved animals, were artistic, loved the family. They were just really Hamisha, good people. I'm so proud to be part of that.
I feel like it's really beautiful to be here today and highlight my grandfather and have him represent all the other men and women that ought to be highlighted as well. So we can all say thank you, because it's tremendous.
Maybe one of these days we can get together and I can hear more about the fascinating story of Ellis Samuel Gordon, a hero for sure. Thank you so much.
In 1942, my father, who was born in the United States, was a high school teenager growing up in Tacoma, Washington, the youngest in a family of 6, whose mother was widowed and spoke little English. And my mother, whose both parents were born in the United States, was a young child of 8 growing up in Los Angeles. Her mother, my grandmother, was 8 months pregnant when their families were incarcerated in the sites known as war relocation centers, set up in remote areas away from the West Coast. My father spoke very little of his experience in the Minidoka War Relocation Center, where his family was interned in Jerome, Idaho. My mother described her time in Heart Mountain War Relocation Center, located in Wyoming, as camp time. As a child, you hear the word camp, you think summer camp, you think hiking, fishing, and things like that. And my mother would talk about going to Yellowstone Park and playing in the Shoshone River. However, my grandparents nor my parents never spoke of the hardships, the injustices, and the humiliation they all endured. But this was typical of the Japanese Americans who spent time in these internment camps. Imagine, they had to liquidate their entire lives, jobs, and assets in a very short period of time. They could only take what they could carry: a suitcase, a pillow, and a blanket. My mother's family spent time in an assembly center set up in the horse stables at the Santa Anita racetracks. My uncle recalls having to fill bags with hay to use as mattresses. Trains with blackout windows transported them to the remote relocation centers. Once there, the conditions were deplorable. They lived in wooden, tar-papered barracks with little protection from the outside. Dust and dirt were everywhere. They endured bitterly cold winters, extremely hot summers. Privacy was non-existent, with communal bathrooms and community mess halls all surrounded by armed guards and barbed wire fences. Skirmishes with the guards were common and witnessed by my mother and her brother and other children in the camps. I can't imagine being a young mother, new mother like my grandmother, having 2 young children and a newborn under these conditions. Eventually, the adults established a semblance of normalcy with barrack schools, churches, social organizations, even developing the barren land to produce crops to supplement their diet, all while being incarcerated for their Japanese heritage, of which 2/3 were American citizens. And in the end, no incident of espionage or sabotage was ever found among those incarcerated or others who were imprisoned in jails for suspicions based only on their race. On the contrary, the most decorated battalion during World War II was the 442nd Regiment, an Army unit comprised of soldiers, including my uncle, whose parents were incarcerated in these war relocation centers. Throughout my life, it's been difficult to draw parallels between the largest incarceration of American citizens and the Jewish Holocaust, but there are some important lessons to be considered. This clear violation of constitutional and human rights was the result of anti-Japanese racial prejudice rooted well before World War II. But the rise of Japan fueled fear and racial hysteria in the United States. The bombing of Pearl Harbor was the turning point. And after the Executive Order 9066 was signed, the anti-Japanese sentiment went into full force. Curfews were imposed. FBI searches without warrants took place. Men were whisked to jail without cause. There were limits on movement. Families were displaced to remote areas with subhuman living conditions. They were identified as aliens, tagged with numbers. Hate signs proliferated. There was a propaganda machine of films and newspaper opinions to convince the public that the internment was for national security. Even Dr. Seuss got in the action. He published a cartoon that depicted the Japanese living in the United States as preparing for a dangerous sabotage of the country. The Civil Liberties Act resulted in a formal apology and a payment of $20,000 to around 82,000 survivors of the internment camps, including my parents and living relatives. But to most survivors, this did not begin to compensate for their deep losses. The most important thing was to have acknowledgement of the wrong with an apology from the president. Of interest, there were a number of Latin American Japanese men, women, and families who were taken from their countries and placed in these internment camps as well. Eventually, this act was extended to those survivors, too. Our presidents have more than once skirted the Constitution with the use of executive orders. And sometimes it's an issue, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's contested legally, sometimes it's not. In the case of Korematsu versus the United States in 1944, where 3 men defied the order and were arrested, the Supreme Court upheld Executive Order 9066. And in 1983, the original convictions of the 3 men were overturned, but as of today, that executive order has not been overturned in any official way. But I think for the most part, unless overturned by the Supreme Court, executive orders get carried out. And today, it might be hard to imagine a similar order being put in place, but it's an extremely powerful tool in the hands of our presidents, and that can never be underestimated. The former Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia, ranked this order as one of the court's most shameful blunders. He made reference to this specific executive order in response to a question from a group of law students at the University of Hawaii in 2014. He stated, "Well, of course, Korematsu was wrong, and I think we have repudiated in a later case. But you are kidding yourself if you think the same thing will not happen again." And he cited the Latin term for, "In times of war, laws fall silent."
As Mr. Sulu in the original Star Trek series, George Takei and the Starship Enterprise crew boldly went where no man has gone before. In real life, Mr. Takei embarked on a similar journey when his family was forcibly relocated to Japanese internment camps, first in Arkansas and later Northern California. That chapter in his life was the inspiration for the Broadway musical Allegiance. Mike Masuka was a member of the U.S. Army's 442nd Infantry Regiment, a World War II fighting unit composed almost entirely of Nisei, second-generation American soldiers of Japanese ancestry. Known for their battle cry, "Go for broke," they fought in several major campaigns in the European theater. The 442 has been recognized as the most decorated unit for its size in American history. In 2017, George Takei, accompanied by the cast of Allegiance, traveled to Hawaii for a ceremony honoring Battalion 442. Mark is a U.S. citizen who was born and raised in Japan, but he's often described as an Asian soul in a Caucasian body. To me, that sounds almost like the start of a haiku. So Mark, why don't you tell us how that came about?
It's an interesting story, really, Joan, because it begins back during World War II when my father was drafted into the Army and became a sergeant and was sent to the Pacific Theater in preparation for the island hopping that was being done in preparation for defeating the Imperial Japanese Army. He ended up on the shores of Iwo Jima, and if any of you have seen Flags of Our Fathers, you know Clint Eastwood did a very nice job depicting that battle. It was bloody in hell. It was really, really an awful conflict where many lost their lives. And my father just about lost his when he exploded a landmine and his whole back was, blown off. And they medevaced him out to Guam. And 6 surgeries later, the doctor looked at him and said, "You better ask the big guy upstairs why you're still alive, because by all accounts, you should have died."
Did he have any contact with his fellow soldiers after the war to find out if any of them had been captured?
It's very interesting, Joan. My father, like so many who've been in the war, would not talk about it. I think for so many combat veterans, when they are done with their service, they want to leave it behind, and maybe some of what they experienced was on the traumatic side. So I always got the sense from my dad that he was reticent to speak about his experience. And it was only recently, once he's kind of come more towards the end of his life in his 90s, that he's opened up a bit more. But he is always quick to just kind of point out that war is just bloody hell, and there's always more to it than gets written down in the history books. And this is even more fascinating for me, Joan, was that because I was living with my dad and mom in Japan, you have to think about this. The very people he was fighting against on the battlefield were now people he was living alongside of, ostensibly as their friend. And for the most part, he did a heroic job. Maybe that was even more heroic than what he did on the battlefield. I don't know, but it was heroic for 40 years that he was able to cross that bridge. So I'm trying to find bridges rather than barriers. And the title of my book is Pathways to Peace, Overcoming Religious Intolerance in Our Global Religious Landscape. I think the world that we live in the 21st century is at a very critical place, not just because of what we're experiencing on a, pandemic level here with the crisis, medically speaking, but also a crisis of the soul. We have a great deal of distrust among the nations, and even within our own nation, we find ourselves at loggerheads with each other. And so often it's motivated out of a position of intolerance for the religious paradigm that people live under, which may not look like our own. We have a microcosm of the entire world on our campus when it comes to expressions of faith. And about 3-4 years ago, the Snyders recognized this. He's the vice president of our board of trustees, and donated the funds to build this sanctuary, which is a house for all faiths. The unique thing about this, Joan, is that if you walk into it, well, first of all, from the outside, I like to affectionately call it concrete origami, maybe because of the Asian connection again, but it does kind of look that way, like these different, slabs of stone have been placed in a kind of almost like an origami shape. In truth, there's 7 panels, which represent the 7 continents of our world, leaning in on each other, and no one panel can remain erect without the others around it. So all of them end up leaning in and together creating this kind of beautiful circular space, a global human family, if you will, with the different faith traditions. So we're stronger when we see each other not as other, but as a unitive, integral part of our global human landscape.
Well, I don't think that Lynn could have picked a better person to be the administrator of this place. It sounds like you're the embodiment of what it's meant to signify.
My dad has said to me on numerous occasions, he said, Mark, don't get so hung up on all the different flavors of ice cream that we have here on Earth, because in heaven it's all vanilla. So I think my dad would approve of the vanilla ice cream that we have in the Snyder Sanctuary.
I'm amazed at the fact that his firsthand experiences with the atrocities of war are in many ways responsible for your pursuit of researching pathways for peace.
Yeah. Yes. Amen to that.
Hitler had a twofold objective for waging war in Europe. The first was the principle of Lebensraum, the belief that exceptional people, such as the Germans, were entitled to more living space, to become a great power, and the way to obtain it was through forced acquisition of European territory. The second was a natural corollary of the first, to rid Europe of its Jews. In fact, so determined was Hitler in achieving the second goal, he envisioned building a museum dedicated to the extinction of the Jewish people, whose exhibits would consist of Torah scrolls, prayer books, menorahs, and other ritual objects looted by the Nazis from Jewish synagogues and homes. Of course, such a museum never came to pass. Instead, there are many museums throughout Europe today, such as the Jewish Synagogue of Prague, which are repositories for these and similar artifacts salvaged from the war. But there is also another Czech museum less than an hour's drive from Prague that is more of a living memorial to the Holocaust than a museum per se. Scene 1, Art from the Ashes. Located on the outskirts of Prague in a town called Terezin, it was originally built in the 18th century as a fortress and named after Empress Maria Theresa. Early in the war, Hitler ordered it transformed into a hybrid ghetto and internment camp that served as a transit station for Jews destined to Auschwitz. Its German name, Theresienstadt, Hitler's so-called model city for the Jews.
A city for the Jews, and I swear they may be displaced, but they need not despair, as long as there's laughter in parkside cafes, with music and laugh as a polka band plays. Though I hoped at the start, still I knew in my heart I should follow the Führer's command. Build a city for the Jews, make it pretty for the Jews, and the world will at last understand. A city for the Jews, like Berlin, such decadent pleasures, it's almost a sin. We guzzle champagne like it's water, not booze, then we poke until dawn. We're such fortunate Jews. Overstated a bit, but I have to admit that we aim for a certain finesse. In our city for the Jews, it's a pity not more Jews can enjoy Adolf Hitler's largesse.
next song is from the score of the musical drama Signs of Life, presented off-Broadway in 2010 by New York City's renowned Amas Musical Theater. It is based on a little-known episode of World War II, a visit to Terezin by the International Red Cross towards the end of the war, spurred on by rumors of what conditions were really like in the camps Hitler had set up throughout Europe. Terezin was selected in part because many of its inhabitants were prominente, well-known Jewish intellectuals, poets, musicians, cabaret performers, and artists. In the months preceding the visit, the inmates were put to work beautifying the camp in order to conceal its true nature from the Red Cross inspectors, inevitably leading them to ask themselves what appeared to be an unanswerable question. When survival depends upon hiding the truth, how does the truth survive? One way was to secretly write poems, make paintings, and draw sketches of the actual conditions and daily activities of life in Terezin, and hide them throughout the camp in the hope that even if they were to perish at the hands of the Nazis, their creations would not. One example of this is a forthcoming illustrated compendium of children's poems written in Yiddish and translated into English by Miriam Hoffman.
Terezin. Lass mir gedenken die Kinder. Lass mir gedenken Junge, die Unschuldige, was wir haben in finstere Lagern verloren. Lass mir sie ewig gedenken. Im Garten. A Garten klein, die Luft ist voll mit Reusen, der Weg ist schmal. Und auf dem Weg spaziert a Jingale, a Kleins. A Jingale, a Kleins, und süß wie a Blimale, was blüht. Wenn das Blimale wird aufblühen, wird schon das Jingale nicht sein.
A great deal of artwork by adults has also been recovered, much of it deemed atrocity propaganda by the Nazis. Inger Auerbacher was one of the 15,000 children held in Terezin. Less than 150 survived. She was one of them. An only child born in Kippenheim, Germany, she and her parents spent 1942 to 1945 in Terezin. At age 85, she is still one of the few still alive today. As an associate producer of the off-Broadway production, I had the privilege of meeting Inga when she spoke at one of our post-performance talkbacks.
Inga, you were 7 years old when you arrived at Terezin with your parents.
Right.
What is your first memory of life when you arrived there? Tell me about it.
Well, we arrived with actually a passenger train in the little town called Bauschowitz, and we were told to get off and leave everything behind. You'll get it later. All you had was a little duffel bag, a blanket, and metal dishes. And I had my doll on my arm. And then we marched about 2 kilometers into the camp. We had many old people on this transport of close to 1,200. I was the youngest. And finally, we arrived in Terezin, and we were searched in an underground area. And then we were sent to the attic of the Dresden barrack, lying on the floor, cement floor, no beds, nothing. It was August. It was very, very hot. No, it was a charade. Even before they came, they sent a lot of people, especially older people who didn't look good anymore. It was overcrowded. They sent them out. They went all to Auschwitz. There were some other camps they sent them there too, in Russia Russian area on the Polish border, whatever, Mali trusting nets. I never even knew about it. They had gas chambers there too. And one transport went to Riga. I met somebody actually who did survive, but most of them went to Auschwitz, and they kept that from us. So they made a charade of the whole place. They made it look like a stage production. There were signs to the school, to the playground. None of these things existed. Houses were painted. Fake stores were put up. And they had like a little coffee house. They pretended to serve coffee. Yes.
Okay, let's fast forward. Take us back to the first week of 1945, May 1945, which turned out to be the last week of the war in Europe.
There were papers floating through there. They were burning some of the records. There was a lot of movement, strange. The trucks were moving out. And I remember climbing one of the barricades. We lived at the edge of the camp at the end. And I wanted to look. I was a real ghetto child by then. And I looked, climbed up. I was 10 years old at the end. And I heard a tremendous explosion. I thought my head was off. I touched my head, and they were throwing in hand grenades. And I went to my parents' side because my father had been a soldier in World War I. He said, they're trying to kill us now. It's very dangerous. So we found this dark cellar, no light, nothing. Somebody had a tiny candle. And I took one thing with me, a prayer book my father found in the garbage. It belonged to a former soldier, because it was like a soldier's prayer book. His name was still in it. And he was from Nuremberg, and he was sent to Auschwitz. And he probably didn't believe in God anymore, or he didn't want to take it. And I still have that prayer book today. I never prayed so hard as on that day. When we were in this dark cellar, it was May 8th, was getting dark outside, and somebody decided to go up. Actually, he was very brave, because who knew what was going on? And then he came back down. We're free. We couldn't trust it. We did not trust it. We went up, and we saw the Russians come in with their tanks, and they were very boisterous. They were playing their accordions, singing, and they were very jovial. Maybe they were drunk or something. I don't know. They were happy the war was coming to an end. And I remember I climbed again this fence. And one soldier, the Russian soldier, handed me a piece of bread, black Russian bread with a mountain of butter on it. I never forgot that good soldier, never. My mother was the cook, my father the butler, and she also had to do some other chores. But we had a roof over our head. But I got a bad cold, which got worse. And I wanted to go to that. And I've been writing poems a long time. And I said, wouldn't it be interesting if somebody could put music to this poem that I wrote? And I'm in this dressing room, and I hear this woman talking, and that she does gigs. I don't know what a gig is at that time. She sings, she does it. So I said, I talked to her. I said, by the way, do you write music too? She said, of course I do. I said, look, I got this amazing meeting coming up in Jerusalem in 1981, and I have a poem, and I would love this to be put to music. He said, well, give it to me. I never had met her before. By the way, at that time, she wasn't married yet, so she was Rosalie Comentucci, Italian, Catholic. And so within a day or so, she had the melody. And it was so special. She played it and sang it to me on the phone. Mm-hmm. And then we started to promote it and try to get it on the program. And it became the only original song presented at that meeting. It was presented by the second generation children of Holocaust survivors. And I went there for the meeting. It was called We Shall Never Forget. I also went to the grave of President Truman to thank him for permitting us to come to this country. I went to the museum there and also saw his grave. And so I felt that is a circle in my life.
In the DP camp, is that how you really learned how to play?
No, I had my sister's husband was a violin player. When he came to the camp, he played violin, and he said, Ruby, get an accordion. He got it for me, a little accordion. He taught me a little bit. Then a German musician was coming, played the accordion there for us. You know, like...
Could you believe that?
And I always looked at him, he said, you like accordion. I could teach you a little accordion. I said, yeah, why not? He took me to his place where the rehearsal out of the P camp, you know. And I'm sitting and watching him. He said, he gave me an accordion to play. And I practiced fine. He said, you like the accordion? This accordion is yours. I said, why? Because this accordion was somebody, the German, gave us, killed somebody, a musician, a Jewish musician, and they took away the accordion. And they gave the accordion to probably at the school or whatever, you know. And I got this accordion.
And he's been playing it since. The whole premise of this Holocaust Survivor Band idea came from an article that was in the New York Times about a woman named Alice Summer Hurst.
Piano player.
She was a Holocaust survivor that played piano in the concentration camps and was lucky enough to survive, her and her son.
110 years she was.
She moved to London and she passed away at 110 years old. So this article was read. So we read it, and a man by the name of Saul Dreyer read it too. And my father's playing, and all of a sudden I sat here and I said, you know what, Daddy? Can I take the microphone? I would love to sing with you. Now, what father's going to tell their daughter no? Whether they're good or whether they're bad? Sure, honey, go take the mic. So I go and I take the mic and I start singing, and I'm like, oh my God, I think I sound pretty good. And my father goes, oi, now I have the idea. We can't find all Holocaust survivors. So what we're going to do is Holocaust survivors and children of. So we had our first concert in March. This was 2014. We did it at Temple Chaim in Margate. We did a free concert. We put money out of our own pocket, advertised it. And we said, who's going to come and listen to us? And all of a sudden they opened up the door and 526 people came in to listen to us.
I try to explain, but here is the shame, but you didn't understand.
were a quartermaster in the war, and you and I know, of course, that the quartermaster is the most important person. But for our audience, tell them, what does a quartermaster do?
Well, quartermaster usually handles all the warehouses. They make sure that there's enough food, there's enough clothing, whatever the mission they're given, they handle that. They'll handle ammunition, but mostly it's food, clothing, drugs, things like that. I was fortunate enough that we had a mobile sales company, quartermaster company, and we traveled all over England supplying officers with their clothing because they didn't have a Gimbel's or a Macy's to go to come to us.
Right.
Mobile store, we traveled from base to base. In 10 months, we did 30,000 miles just in England alone.
And there's one a touching story regarding the 8th Air Force officers. I think they were bomber pilots, and they had been prisoners of war. And we're dealing now with Antwerp. If you could tell us that story, Abe.
Right. Well, we were in Antwerp about a couple of months before the officers were starting. They were starting to liberate them. So we were just selling clothing to all the officers in the area. But when they started to get the pilots and it was all officers. There were pilots, there were co-pilots, bombardiers, whoever they were. We started to get them back and we had to redress them. They came in with the clothes on their back. They had nothing, and they was, I hate to say it, but they were a sorry looking bunch. They were dejected. When they address a GI as sir, it makes you feel that these people, you know, were beat down. So our mission then was we started to redress them. We gave them everything they needed until one afternoon we ran out of insignias for the officers. And in the store, it was a pretty good relationship with the captain and myself, because it wasn't a captain and a GI. We were like equals there. We discussed it and we said, look, we can't send these men home without insignia. It wouldn't be nice. So it was decided that I would take a trip from Antwerp to Paris, which was 190 miles of unmarked roads, because the French had taken down all the road signs. So now you're traveling with a map. And thank God their maps were pretty good. So I got to Paris about 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, and they had already put the order on the dock because they didn't know what time I was getting there. We loaded it up and I started back. Now it was dark. Can you imagine driving 190 miles with a little flashlight to look at the map and get back to Antwerp, which I did. And the next day when the store opened, we had all the insignia. It made me feel good that these men were going home honorably. That was probably one of my best experiences in the Army.
Abe, you and I walked around the Normandy landing beaches in the summer for the 75th anniversary of D-Day, and I had the great honor of walking around with you at the American Cemetery during that anniversary commemoration. I was overcome with emotion, and so therefore I can't even imagine the feelings you must have had going back to Normandy and walking around those hallowed places. Could you share with us your thoughts about doing that?
Well, it was hard to explain. You looked at it, and in my mind was all these men. I think that cemetery had like 9,000 graves, and all these men died just to protect us, the rest of the country. And my thought always was, we saved Europe, but I don't think it was very well appreciated, believe me. Maybe at the beginning it was, but toward the end, I don't think it was really appreciated. What we poured, materials don't matter, it's life. And we've lost 400,000 men in Europe, which to me it was unthinkable that we would fight a war for somebody else, really, and lose 400,000 of our youngest and best people.
That's why it's so important that these commemorations and events at Normandy, at the American Cemetery, continue every year, and events like the one we're having now to recall and remember and commemorate the Holocaust and the liberation of it. I will say that I was pleasantly surprised and overwhelmed by the amount of respect that I saw afforded to you and several of the veterans. When we were walking around the American Cemetery, I couldn't count how many people came up to you and just wanted to shake your hand or take a picture with you, including young kids, which made me especially happy.
I think that trip was the most inspiration. It made me feel so good when mothers came over with their little kids and said, "Can you take a picture with my daughter or my son?" It made me feel good to be recognized.
Hello, I'm Dr. Sam Bierstock. I can't tell you how honored and pleased I am to be asked to be part of these wonderful Liberation Commemoration Day ceremonies, and I'm very anxious to share my story with you about the opportunities that I've been very fortunate to have to interact with and thank, literally, through a song that I wrote, millions of World War II veterans. And the very unique opportunities that I've had to meet so many of them and hear their stories, because as you may know, many of them talked very little about their experiences in World War II. In my own case, I went through quite a transition. I am a physician. In my early days of specialty training, I was assigned to the VA hospital in Boston, and this was in the early 1970s. And the attitude that we had as physicians at that time, in retrospect, I'm quite sorry of and a little bit ashamed of, because the veterans were suffering quite a bit in those days. It was not that long after the war, 25 years, and we saw so many of them with their common problems, mostly related to alcohol and smoking. They had been so badly traumatized. Those were not days when PTSD was a recognized syndrome. And so we were repeatedly seeing people with the same problems, smoking and alcohol-related cancers and heart disease and tumors of all kinds. And we kind of had an attitude of, well, you know, they brought it upon themselves for these habits, without a full appreciation of what these men had been through. In the mid-1990s, after I had left practice, I toured the country with a band that I had. And I was returning from an event in California back to Florida about 1 in the morning. And as I was leaving the parking lot, there was an elderly man collecting tolls. And I said to him, "Have a nice evening." And he said to me, "I took 2 bullets for this country, and look what I'm doing." And I had already started to drive away, so I thought for a second about what he had said and stopped and backed up. And I said, "Sir, I've had a really wonderful life in this country, and I want to thank you for what you did." And he started to cry. I was really moved. I went home and that night couldn't sleep, and in the morning I wrote down some lyrics. It's a rather long story, but the wonderful end of it is I wrote a song called "Before You Go," which was a thank you and tribute to our World War II veterans, which I posted on the internet for free listening to and seeing a visual that was associated with it. And it became a phenomenal success. In 2013, it had been listened to more than 25 million times, and reached people all over the world. And it was a wonderful way for me to thank our World War II veterans, and resulted in a lot of speaking engagements and performances of the song around the country and on the major cable media. Among the people that I was very honored to meet as a result were many, many World War II veterans who told me stories of their experiences that were just harrowing, unbelievable experience, which many of them just had to live with and rarely talked about. I remember talking to one veteran who told me that he had been waking up screaming every night for 70 years. If it hadn't been for his wife, he was quite certain he wouldn't be alive. I met men who were captured by headhunters and cannibals in the Pacific, who helped them because those tribal members didn't like the Japanese. So I'm going to take a minute now and tell you about a couple of men who have become friends, and men that I've gotten to know, who exemplify so many of their fellow members of the greatest generation. And the first person I'd like to tell you about is now a 95-year-old gentleman by the name of Bill Schwartz, who does about 100 sit-ups every morning. He's sharper than most people that I know combined. And Bill had quite an amazing history during the war. This is a picture of Bill Schwartz today, age 95, a very vigorous gentleman. And Bill participated in the landings at Normandy on D-Day, which I'll tell you about in a moment, which his stories of what that experience are like are really quite horrifying and amazing. He was initially volunteering as a pilot during the war. And he had many hours of experience. He was actually an acrobatic pilot, but he was turned down and didn't know why for some time, and it ultimately became apparent to him, and he was told directly that he just wasn't accepted because he was a Jew. So he had to reassess his participation. He wanted to be very much a part of defending the country, and he did change course and ultimately became a captain and landed at Normandy on D-Day with about 800 to 1,200 men under his command. During that first 24 hours, Bill lost 80% of the men under his command. To this day, he finds this quite haunting, and talks frequently about the fine young men that he watched die during the devastation of that landing. He's, of course, like all of the vets, has his share of PTSD, which he compensates for very well, and has a very vigorous life since the time of that experience. But I thought that the horror that he must have lived through to experience the loss of that many men in such a short period of time is really something for us to bear in mind. Next, I'd like to tell you about this very remarkable man, Erwin Stovroff. Erwin passed away in 2019. I was honored to have him become a very, very close friend. He had a remarkable story. Erwin was a bombardier who flew 45 missions over Europe and occupied France. He flew the required number of missions and then was told they had to do 5 more, and on his very, very last flight was shot down. And this is an actual photo of Erwin's plane after it was hit on its way down. Erwin was captured, became a prisoner of war, and one of the most remarkable and moving stories that he told me, he became quite emotional about every time he told me this story. But he was placed in a lineup with quite a few other men, 50 or 60 other men, and the German guards said, "All Jews take 2 steps forward." this was because their intent was to take them off and shoot them. And Irwin said that without a word being said, every man in that line took a step forward. And the commanding officer went up to the commanding German officer and said, "We have no Jews in this line. We have no Catholics. We have no Protestants. We have only Americans. And if you harm one of them, since this war is almost over, I will find you after the war and hunt you down, and I will kill you." And Irwin thought that he was the bravest man that he had ever encountered in his life. That man was subsequently thrown into solitary confinement for having done that. But the story about each of these men stepping forward was something that Irwin would never forget, and became quite emotional in telling his story. Irwin went on to a remarkable life after the war, and he spent part of his time at the VA hospitals helping other veterans to get their, and other prisoners of war to get their benefits. And he learned in the late 1980s that the government did not pay for support dogs for veterans who were injured in the wars against terror that were occurring in the 1980s and 90s. And he started a company called Vets Helping Heroes, a 501c3 corporation, which raised money to provide dogs for these wounded and injured vets. And at the time of my telling you the story, his organization has raised between $8 and $10 million and provided dogs to these veterans who are suffering so much from PTSD, and it's really a wonderful service. So Irwin went on to serve the country in many ways right up until the very end. Now, I mentioned earlier that because of the success of my tribute song, Before You Go, I was invited to speak to many, many groups of veterans around the country, the survivors of Pearl Harbor, people gathering for Holocaust Remembrance Day, and many, many other events. But one that I'd like to tell you about now is my experience with the survivors of the sinking of the U.S. Indianapolis. In 1945, the U.S. Indianapolis was commissioned to deliver the atomic bomb that was to be dropped on Hiroshima to the island of Tinia, from which it was loaded onto the aircraft called the Enola Gay and dropped on Hiroshima. After delivering the bomb, the Indianapolis set route to return to its departing port and asked for submarine escort, anti-submarine escort, because they were concerned about Japanese presence in the waters they were sailing through. But the Navy assured them that there were no reports of Japanese submarines and no escort was sent. So after a couple of days en route back, they were attacked by Japanese submarines, and the ship was sunk. There were about 1,117 men on board, and most of them went into the water, which was shark infested, and they spent 5 days in the water clinging to rafts, and only 317 survived. Virtually all of the rest died from attacks by sharks and from heat and exposure. It was 5 horrifying days. The Navy did not know that the ship had been sunk for several days and recovered them ultimately, spread out over a course of several hundred miles. So these men had about as harrowing an experience as you might imagine. I had the opportunity to speak to them and perform Before You Go for them, and to meet many of them. Approximately 20 of them were well enough to attend the reunion that I spoke to. This is a picture taken of me with the 20 or so survivors of the sinking of the Indianapolis. That's me on my knee at the far right, shortly after I spoke. It was quite something to have time with these men. They did not talk very much about their time in the water, but they were very, very grateful to a man who was very involved in helping to save them when they were finally discovered. Ships were dispatched and rescue rafts, and there was one man who refused to get back on the raft and go back to the ship until he had found as many of the survivors as he could, and they regarded him as quite an angel, and they invited him to all of their reunions. There's an interesting postscript to the story. This is the captain of the Indianapolis, Charles McVeigh III. The survivors of the sinking are and were 100% loyal to him, although the Navy faulted him for the fact that his ship was sunk, even though they had told him there were no subs in the area. And he was, in fact, court-martialed by the Navy. This haunted him for his entire life, and he committed suicide in 1968. About 30 years later, a 12-year-old schoolboy named Hunter Scott read the story of the sinking of the Indianapolis and took it upon himself to launch a campaign to clear the name of Captain McVeigh. He had the complete support of the crew that survived the sinking of the Indianapolis, and in the year 2000, the U.S. Congress exonerated Captain McVeigh. Hunter Scott enjoyed the deep and profound appreciation of all of the survivors who remained faithful to and loyal to the captain to the very end. So I'm very grateful to have been able to share just a few of these stories with you. And what I'd like to do now in conclusion is play Before You Go in tribute and thanks to our wonderful generation of veterans who literally preserved everything about our way of lives for us. It's a thank you to those who gave so much to all of us. I hope that you'll enjoy it, and I hope that you'll thank any veterans who you see who may still be with us, and certainly for their families who supported them and in essence went through the war with them even afterwards, if they are the descendants of these veterans, because they certainly lived with the consequences of their parents' experience. So I'm going to play Before You Go now, and again, it's with thanks to all of those who did so much for us. Thank you.
Quietly you've all turned gray. You did your job, you saved our way. Our life and freedom you preserved. We've thanked you less than you deserve. You never boasted, bragged or asked for adulation for your past. You did the job you knew was right, and quietly you cry at night for bodies maimed and comrades lost, for sights beyond our furthest thoughts, for what you lived and felt and seen, for what the cost of freedom means. You leave us blessed with every breath that cost you arms and legs and death. You won the worst and greatest war. We owe you more, we owe you more. shining sea to shining sea. Thank you, thank you, thank you, go in peace.
My name is Jacob Solomon. I'm privileged to serve as the president and CEO of the Greater Miami Jewish Federation. Judaism is a religion that's about things that are joyous. We're commanded every day to praise God in happiness. And Jewish culture, to me, is a celebration of Jewish life. Now, it's also interesting that culture is not only the product of Jewish life, but it's also a portal into Jewish life. And I think that for those of us who work in the community, it's very exciting to see how culture touches people. I think it was in the Pew study that asked the question of what does it mean to be Jewish? What's the essential characteristic that defines being Jewish? And I believe the first one was recalling the lessons of the Holocaust. And I think Jewish humor was the second one. It does speak to the power of culture, especially in North America, as a means of connecting with how Jews feel about themselves. So the idea for me of having an organization of like-minded people who care deeply about this aspect of Jewish culture and Yiddish in particular is wonderful. And it means that there are like-minded people who are stacking hands and saying, you know, we can do something about this, and it will add Jewish energy to our landscape and bring an important voice to